In today's world, people feel lost in a sea of ideas. Which ones should we accept? Stay tuned because you're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Here is your host, Kurt Jaros.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here on another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. On this episode, we're talking about faith, specifically the doctrine of original sin. And to get even more specific, I'll be talking about the so-called Semi-Pelagians. In this episode, I'm hoping to just come to you today a bit laid back, hoping to get some questions from some of the followers here online, but also talk about my doctoral research on John Cassian, Vincent of Lorraine, and Faustus of Ries. And, of course, there are different French pronunciations for some of these places, so I just try my best. And there are even some Latin pronunciations. So I'm happy to talk about the work that I've done. I'm on deadline now. I've got just a few weeks until I have to submit a final draft. And basically the work that I have left is just to revise some footnotes and have them all be consistent with each other. So I'm looking forward to finishing up. It's been 5 years that I've been researching and writing at a part-time pace about these guys. And there are a lot of misconceptions out there about who they were, what they believed, and why study these guys? Well, it's very much related to the Calvinist-Arminian discussions that Protestants have to the present day. And so that's really what got me interested in learning more about these guys. But I guess before I jump in, certainly I have to promote the upcoming Defenders Conference. So on October 18 and 19 at Christ Church of Oak Brook, we're talking about gospel differences, and we've invited 4 scholars to present their views on why there are differences in the Gospels. And, well, why should I talk about it? Maybe we should just let me also talk about it in a promo video that we made. So check this out. Memoir presents a picture of who Jesus was, and sometimes these pictures differ in their accounts. What he said, what he did, when he did it, who was there. For some people, these differences can be a barrier to faith because the Gospels are allegedly, historically, unreliable. Hi, this is Kurt Jaros with Defenders Media, and let me tell you about the best apologetics conference in the world. Our annual Defenders Conference brings together different perspectives on one particular issue. This year, we've invited 3 Christian scholars, Mike Licona, Craig Keener, and Rob Bowman, all to present their case for why there are differences in the Gospels. We've also invited an enthusiastic, intelligent non-Christian, Bart Ehrman. If you haven't had the chance to engage much with a non-Christian perspective on the Gospels, then it's baptism by fire. Join us on October 18 and 19 in Oak Brook, Illinois, as these various speakers present their case on why there are differences in the Gospels. Be sure to go to our website for more information and registration, thedefendersconference.com. Are you prepared to give an answer for the hope within, or perhaps to address your own doubts? We look forward to seeing you. So, the Defenders Conference is going to be a great opportunity. Friday night, Saturday. Stay the weekend. Go see the city of Chicago on Sunday and head on home Sunday night or Monday if you're able to. It's really just a fun weekend for folks also interested in these apologetic topics. Last year, our conference was on the alleged genocide commands. Now, for this new format that we've been doing for our conference, which we started last year, I have to always say now allegedly or some qualifier like that because, well, we've got different views on this. So some people don't even want to say there are differences in the Gospels. I don't think we can go that far. I think I think there's a better case to be made that there are no contradictions. So the question is, what is a contradiction? What is a difference? And, well, it's just going to be a real fun time hearing from these scholars. And you should consider coming to Chicago just in a couple weeks. So looking forward to that. Okay, so my doctoral research. Here it is. I've got a draft printed, by the way, for those that are watching this. Here's my thesis. It's 345 pages, not even including the bibliography, which that might be a whole nother like 15 to 20 pages at least. So yeah, it's been a great big work, a labor of love. And so what has got me interested in the Semi-Pelagians? Well, I am interested in the soteriological discussions between Calvinists and Arminians, and I never really felt at home in either of those camps, certainly not the Calvinist camp. And so when I went to Biola, the theology professor said, well, you can be one of two positions. You can be a Calvinist or you can be an Arminian. Well, I feel bad for the Lutherans and Catholics. They've been around longer than the Calvinists and the Arminians have, so I wonder what they believed. Certain biblical interpretations by Calvinists and Arminians I didn't fully agree with. And even the Arminians, while I was much closer to that view, never really, again, felt at home. And then I also heard about these Semi-Pelagians. So I guess before we even get into the Semi-Pelagians, people unfamiliar with this, Chris is nodding his head, I should talk about Augustine and Pelagius. Well, St. Augustine, or Augustine, was a bishop of Hippo in North Africa, and he has the largest corpus, he has the largest amount of works in Christian history in the Latin West from the Church Fathers. And so he is very well known for his confessions. He's well known for the City of God, some other writings as well. But he's also known for his defeating of Pelagianism. And what is Pelagianism? Well, there was a monk named Pelagius who was from modern-day Great Britain, and he was a very holy man. He was pious, and he was kind of cushy with the powers that be in Rome. But he believed that you could earn your salvation, that the fall of Adam didn't affect Adam's progeny, and that we were, each of us, created just like Adam. I'm painting with broad strokes here. There are specifics about what Pelagius believed and what specifically was condemned. But those were two critical points to Pelagianism. There were others as well. But the two critical points, again, that you could earn your salvation and that the fall didn't affect humanity in any drastic way, just sort of like a sociological way, that now we are born into a world with bad examples. So, who were the Semi-Pelagians? Well, what has been labeled the Semi-Pelagians were monks that responded to Augustine and Pelagius, and it's frequently communicated that these monks tried to build a bridge between the two camps. Augustine believed, well, there's some debate over what Augustine believed, but he certainly believed salvation was by grace, and that you couldn't earn it yourself. Also believed that in the fall presented drastic consequences. He also believed some further things, and again, there's debate over exactly what he believed. He shifts his views at a certain point, changes them, admittedly. One moment here. Oh, a sneeze. Excuse me.
Bless you.
Thank you, Chris. All right, so you have Augustine and Pelagius, and you have these monks from southern France. Now, these were not the first monks to query Augustine, but they were the first to object. The first monks to query Augustine, that is, to question what it was he was really saying, were monks from another city in North Africa called Hadramedum. And these monks were concerned that what Augustine had written was defeating for the monastic lifestyle. That is, if salvation was grace and nothing else, why work out your salvation? Why would you put to death the desires of the flesh, as the monks really tried to do? So they wrote to him seeking clarification, and he wrote two responses to them, and I might have it here around the corner. it would be neat to show everyone. Nicene and post-Nicene Fathers are somewhere. Well, it's not popping up here. I'll load it up. But so he wrote 2 works, 2 of his final letters. So this happened towards the end of his life. Augustine died in 430 AD. And one of the works was called On Rebuke and Grace. And he basically tries to toe the line, showing that it's still beneficial to work out and go through the process of sanctification. Now, we don't hear from the monks at Hadramedum ever again, so we presume maybe their concerns were met. But we do hear from other monks, and we hear from a disciple of Augustine named Prosper of Aquitaine, and also one of his associates, Hilary the layman, not to be confused with the later Hilary of Arles, who was a bishop. So Prosper and Hilary both write letters to Augustine, and they describe the monks in southern Gaul, and that would be modern-day southern France. So from their letters, we can discover a few things of what they said. And sometimes this is beneficial and sometimes it's not, because we're not sure if Prosper was accurately communicating the right beliefs of the monks. So there's debate over that. All right, I'm going to load up here, let's see here, my thesis. I've got some hot links to different sections. So it would be very helpful to first see what Prosper says, and then today I'm going to get into the primary sources as well, and some other issues, including the Second Council of Orange, which is another interesting take. So let's see here. Okay, so here we have the monks at Hadramedum. Okay, so to them, Augustine wrote Grace and Free Choice, and also Rebuke and Grace. Then what happened at Gaul, we have here Augustine's last 2 works. Okay, so here, so the letter from Prosper. Prosper makes known the anti-Augustinian sentiment. And there's debate even among some scholars about whether the monks were responding to Augustine directly or to a certain form of Augustinianism. Sometimes scholars call this extreme or hyper-Augustinianism. And in my dissertation, I actually even sort of question that because, unfortunately, these historical theologians don't go through the efforts of trying to show how hyper-Augustinianism is not Augustinianism. So that's still a question that some historical theologians haven't waded into, whether the views in Gaul are representative of St. Augustine himself. All right, so Prosper writes, against this doctor, that is Augustine, resplendent with the glory of so many palms and so many crowns which he gained for the exaltation of the church and the glory of Christ, some of ours, to their own great misfortune, speak and murmur in secret. But we came to know their criticisms. When they find ears ready to listen, they defame the writings Augustine published against the Pelagian error. They say he completely sets aside free will and under the cover of grace upholds fatalism. So you've got some concepts there. Prosper says of these other monks, indeed even church leaders, they say he is completely set aside free will and under cover of grace upholds fatalism. Those familiar with the Calvinist Arminianism debate will see these concepts here. Free will under the cover of grace, or setting aside free will, right? That's a concern Arminians have against Calvinists. Under the cover of grace, the idea that it's only grace. So even Arminians would claim of Calvinists, or even Calvinists would say of their own position, that grace is the reason for everything, and the human will does not have faith. Faith itself is the gift that God gives. And so then this last one here upholds fatalism. So this is the concern that Arminians have against Calvinism, that it just leads to this sort of determinism where we don't have any responsibility for our actions. So you see some of these similar attacks, whether they're warranted or not, place that aside. But this is what the monks believed. So this is the scope of my dissertation, looking at the Semi-Pelagians. I'm not necessarily here arguing they were right in their views. It's a historical investigation. So I'm arguing for a specific view and interpretation of their writings. So that places aside whether I think they were right or my own positions on the matter. In fact, I do personally think they were wrong on some issues, but on some other ones I think they were right on, and even more so than Arminians today. So I would more closely associate with what these guys said, but I don't think that label Semi-Pelagian is a good one, and we're going to get into that a little bit later in the second half of the program. Okay, so Prosper and Hilary write to Augustine, and Augustine, he writes back. And so he writes back the two final works that he formally, officially publishes or writes. So he pens on the predestination of the saints and also the gift of perseverance. And they were written either about 428 or 429. Folks think just a year before he died. So in there, Augustine references the monks, and he calls them Christian brothers. And he says that they are simply mistaken on the issue of predestination. But he says that they are not Pelagians. And that's also really important because Prosper believes that the monks here, John Cassian, or as I call Cassian and Company for short, Prosper believes they are, quote, the remnants of Pelagius. That's really what Prosper believed. And Augustine corrects him on that. And I think that's vitally important for our discussions in contemporary Protestantism, because Augustine viewed these guys and their views as orthodox, broadly speaking, Christian orthodox. So the issue that he took with them was over the doctrine of predestination. And a lot of people say the Second Council of Orange rejected Semi-Pelagianism, but it never embraced Augustine's view of predestination. So I'll contend, and will contend in debates and talks and books that I publish, that we cannot say the Second Council of Orange defeated Semi-Pelagianism. So we're going to get more into that, and eventually I'm hoping that I can break down and do maybe an episode on each of my chapters. That'd be a lot of fun. Right now, I'm just sort of giving an overview, an update for those that are unfamiliar with my research. And I've sort of kept a close guard here of this material intentionally, because sometimes in PhD stuff, you don't want it to get out. Someone else might steal your idea or something like that. Thankfully, I don't think I have to worry about that. This is a very narrow issue. So getting back here to the historical facts of the matter. So what happens is Augustine writes these works on the predestination of the saints and gift of perseverance in response here. And that's basically the last we hear of Augustine. So that happens in 428, 429, sometime around then. So when and where do these so-called Semi-Pelagians come in? The first one, chronologically speaking, is John Cassian. As I mentioned, Prosper certainly has heard of, maybe even interacted with Cassian. So this is happening before Augustine writes it in response. Cassian is contemporaneous with Augustine, and there's debate over where he was born, but he spent much of his young adult life in Egypt, learning from the Egyptian monastic fathers. Monasticism was born in Egypt. Basically, what would happen is people would forsake living a common lifestyle, seeking after worldly pleasures, and they would go and live off in the desert, literally. Sometimes they did this by themselves. Sometimes they did it in clusters. So Cassian learns from them, and eventually, likely because his leaders are kicked out, he finds himself up under the authority and leadership of John Chrysostom. And Chrysostom was the bishop of Constantinople, and Cassian is ordained by Chrysostom into the ministry. And he was under Chrysostom's authority and leadership for a couple years, but eventually Cassian goes westward and ends up landing in southern France, in Marseille, where, as tradition holds, he founds 2 monasteries, one for men and one for women. And what Cassian does, so there were certain very small attempts at a monastic movement in southern Gaul, but what Cassian does is he brings Eastern monasticism to the West, and he tailors it for his audience. We have done, I believe, an episode with Augustine Cassidy where he talks about Cassian, and so that's a bit more technical than what I'm even hoping to present here. But for those that want to learn more, I'd go back and find that episode. That would be, which episode? Chris, don't you know all the episodes?
Which one?
The one with Augustine Cassidy. I'm searching it here. It'll pop up. Oh, of course, Veracity Hill doesn't pop up, so with Augustine Cassidy. His CV is extensive. Let's see here. Episode 73 is that one if you want to check that out, for the love of historical theology. Okay, so Cassian, his most famous work is the Conferences, and these are the teachings of the Egyptian fathers. And they are not a word for word communication. Cassian has tailored the message. He has, dare I say this, invented speeches that are the voice of the Egyptian fathers. And so in this, especially Conference 13, he presents some controversial statements about the role of man in the process of salvation. And he says in some cases that the humans take the initiative in the salvation process, and by which he means that faith comes out of or from the human. And to prosper, this was a no-no. And so this is why he writes to Augustine. And in fact, Prosper wrote a response book called basically Against the Conferencer. And that is a work explicitly written against Cassian. And what makes this interesting, sometimes in historical theology, we only have one side of the conversation. We have what one person says, and they might be quoting, or the trouble is we don't get comments in context, so we don't know for sure if those are fair interpretations. But, so here's the nice thing. With Cassian, we have his works, and we also have Prosper's work. So we can compare and contrast whether Prosper wrote fairly against Cassian. And there are some scholars today that say, no, he didn't, actually. And in fact, you can see how he lifts clauses out of Cassian's own sentences, and that it conveys a different idea, which Cassian himself surely did not intend to convey. You can see here I'm sympathetic to those scholars that think Cassian was mistreated. And also, too, when we look at Cassian's broader thoughts and other segments where he talks about the necessity of grace for every good action, the seeds of goodness that God implants and that God waters. So you can see here, how can Cassian hold those two things, that man plays this role, but then God does this work? It's because for Cassian, there's cooperative action here. It's a both and, not an either or. And that's a very important distinction in these three monks, John Cassian, Vincent of Lorentz, and Faustus of Ries. When we're talking about nature and grace and how grace works, we're not looking at either the grace of God or the free will of man. We're looking at both the grace of God and the free will of man. And that is vitally important for how we understand the Semi-Pelagians, how we look at the Second Council of Orange, how we look at Augustine's own thought. And all of this is related to original sin, because what is the type of human nature that humans inherit as the result of the fall? Is it a human nature that can will the good? Or is it a human nature that cannot will the good, objectively speaking? So we've had a number of episodes where we've talked about that. I recall we did a show on Calvinism where I was talking to my guest about who was Reformed, about whether Calvinists think humans can do good actions. He said, yes, of course, civic goods. An atheist can walk his grandmother across the street. That's a civic good. But is it good in the eyes of God? And that's really what I'm wondering. And the Calvinists said that my understanding was correct. The Calvinist position is no. An atheist walking his grandma across the street is not an objectively good action, because the atheist does it out of, selfish desires, or he wants some benefit in the end. Okay. So we've got a couple more minutes before we need to take a break. Let's see here. I'm going to see if there are any questions. No questions yet, but there are some people watching. So thank you. If you do have a question, let me know. I know that there were some folks that commented earlier about this episode when I teased it yesterday on social media. I believe it was John and let's see here. Gordon. Oh, there is a comment or question from Davey. Let's talk about that first. Davey, thanks for watching, tuning in. Monastics, kind of the Egyptian Amish. Yeah, that's right. They wanted simple living. They didn't want any valuables. And in fact, in many cases, not always, sometimes people think this is always the case, but in many cases, they had to take a vow of poverty. And sometimes, and with the monastics, some of them were secluded, and some of them actually worked and associated in society sort of on a regular basis. They would sell goods, because they had to feed themselves, and they had to still make a living. So they would work the land. They would, a lot of monasteries are known for wine making. So there was still this interaction with society as opposed to complete isolation. Of course, in Egypt, it was more isolated than in southern Gaul. But now there was an island in the coast of France, a couple islands called the Islands of Lorraine, and there was a monastery there founded by a fellow named Saint Honoratus. So island life was probably a bit more secluded. I believe it's like 20 miles off the coast. So I've been there. In fact, it's the background to my desktop here. And in fact, Chris, maybe I'll lift this up. Although it's probably not going to look good on the camera. But the island is really cool. Here's the monastery, which was revamped. Chris says quality looks all right. So here, and actually, you can see here, this building was created to keep the monks safe from scavengers and pirates and foreign invaders. They would climb up in a ladder and remove the ladder so that their attackers would have trouble getting them. Fascinating. So Michaela and I have been there. And so that's where Vincent of Lorraine spent time. And some people think the Commonitorium, which he wrote, was not written there, but nevertheless is associated there. And his thought certainly was very influential. So Michaela and I traveled there before I started the PhD program. All the more so it's meaningful to me. I'd love to go back someday and do some manuscript hunting, as they say. All right. So I've just sort of given a broad overview. I've gone through a little bit of the figures. I haven't even really talked much about Vincent or Faustus. Hopefully I'll get the chance here in the second half of the program, and I'll talk about the Second Council of Orange as well. That's a fun thing. So hopefully I've whet your appetite, and you'll continue on with me learning along about who these guys were. And again, I'll be beating the dead horse of the importance for our discussions today and for fairly interpreting who these guys were and the value their views can bring to the contemporary Protestant discussions. So stick with us through this short break from our sponsors.
You're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
Evangelical Christians are talking about hell. What if we believe what we believe because we've always believed it? What if the gospel is really a matter of life and death? We want you to open your mind, open your Bible, and rethink hell. At rethinkinghell.com, evangelicals look at what the Bible says about hell, putting conventional and controversial views to the test.
Let's say there's this Christian apologist. You love their message, but have trouble finding their videos, their articles, or social media posts. How do you stay connected to them? We're on it. Defenders Media uses the tools of the digital age to create content for your favorite apologists. We give them more screen time, more digital soapboxes, and more presence to deliver more of the content that you love. That's what we do.
I know that social media is important to those of you who follow my work. Many respond to my videos and posts on Facebook and Twitter, but it becomes impossible after a while to keep up with it all and to continue with research. That's why I'm thrilled that we have found a solution, Defenders Media.
Whether it's a website, whether it's printed material, whether it's a question on graphics, I cannot do what I do and reach my audience without the help of Defenders Media. They have been integral in helping me to reach my audience.
Defenders Media ensures consistent content reaches your hand from today's leading apologists and apologetic ministries, like Mike Licona, Apologetics 315, the Veracity Hill Podcast with Kurt Jaros, and more.
To learn more, text the word Defenders to 555-888 and we'll send you a free PDF of the top 5 ways to share the gospel online. Thanks for sticking with us through that short break from our sponsors. If you'd like to learn how you can become a sponsor, you can go to our website, veracityhill.com, click on that patron tab to learn more. And if you want to be a supporter who just chips in a few bucks each month to keep us going and growing, we would love to get your support. And this is certainly something that I'm looking to do as I expand my teaching ministry, and hoping once I finish the dissertation to get into doing some public debates and publish some works. It should be a lot of fun. It's exciting to see the progress from research and writing to go into publication. And on that, as I'm working on my professional development in academia, I've also got a chapter in a book that's been accepted for publication on presuppositionalism. That's one of my interests in apologetic methodology. And so I'm very pleased to say that. The book will be published by the Davenant Press. So I'm sure I'll give more attention when that book comes out. So I'll talk about that. And maybe we'll do a show on presuppositionalism. Invite Scott Oliphant on. That'd be good. I've had a chance to dialogue with him on Justin Brierley's Unbelievable program. All right, well, in this laid-back episode here, I'm talking about my research, whetting your appetite about and introducing you, perhaps, for the first time to John Cassian, Vincent of Lorenz, and Faustus of Ries. And I talked about Augustine and Pelagius, Prosper. There are a lot of figures here, but it's really important to remember who these guys are because of the value that they bring to the table. So Prosper and Hilary, while they were opponents of the Gallic monks, they do talk about what these guys believed. They do mention how they believe there are consequences for the fall, for example, and that distinguishes them from the Pelagians. And in fact, the Gallic monks, as I've called them, write explicitly against Pelagius and Pelagianism. So let me talk about that before getting into Vincent and Faustus. The ways in which these guys distinguish themselves from Pelagianism. Cassian wrote a work. It's the only Western work in church history written against Nestorianism. Now, Nestorianism is the belief that there were two persons in Christ, there was the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, that's one person, and there was Jesus of Nazareth, the human side, that's another person. So a fellow named Nestorius believed this, and Cassian was asked to write a work against that. So what makes this intriguing is that Cassian associates Nestorianism with Pelagianism, and he's the first to do so. And I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty there, but the point that we need to know is that Cassian explicitly in his work against Nestorianism calls out Pelagianism as a heresy. Now, there's questions and a discussion about Conference 13 and the material there, whether that is written against Pelagianism. There are some scholars that think that is the case. And in fact, there's one scholar, Augustine Cassidy, who believes that Conference 13 is more against Pelagianism than it is Augustinianism. And the reason why there's some of this debate is because Cassian doesn't name names. He just talks about ideas and principles. So sometimes we have to draw out conclusions, and that's where historical theologians get into the debates and discussions about maybe who the author's intended audience was, or who he was critiquing, if anybody at all. So that's why there's debates between historical theologians. And here in the office, I have a shelf, basically one level just devoted toward books for my doctoral research. So a lot of fun books there. Okay, so Cassian writes against Nestorianism, but in there he writes against Pelagianism. Vincent of Lorenz, in his Commonitorium, explicitly calls Pelagius. He basically insults him. That's what the church fathers did back then. They insulted people that were heretics. So Vincent does that. And then Faustus also, in the prologue and first two chapters of De Gratia, specifically, explicitly calls out Pelagius for his views. So these guys were not sympathetic to Pelagianism. They, in fact, critiqued it many times explicitly. So there's no sympathies there for that view. So in calling them Semi-Pelagians, is that really a fair assessment? No, it's not. Some historical theologians have opted to call these guys Semi-Augustinians. And there's been some welcoming to that label. But unfortunately, other scholars, rightly, I would agree with, would also say they would not call themselves Semi-Augustinian. These guys did not try to create a bridge between those two camps. These guys were defending Eastern Greek theology. If I had to give it in anachronistic terms, it would be like an Eastern Orthodox view in the Protestant West. When that happens, we can't say you're trying to build something from two other views. They already believed something else, and they brought it over geographically. So Cassian's work was very important for that movement. And it really was a movement. I'm talking many church bishops defended this view of what's been designated as Semi-Pelagianism. But we'll get into that towards the end of the show. Vincent, all right, he's got some important works. The Commonitorium helps us to understand the governing rule of faith or doctrine specifically. How is it that we can understand and know what is the true teaching of the church? So he wrote this excellent work about that. And he even makes some fine arguments about how sometimes even church leaders are corrupted, and sometimes poor thought enters into the church, and that we need to sometimes, many times, get rid of this. And so I think some of that is indirectly critiquing Augustinianism. But again, scholars debate the issue. So maybe one day I'll get into the specific arguments. I'd like to, and certainly do in the dissertation. Okay, so there's the Commonitorium. There are also what are called the Vincentian objections. And these are objections attributed to Vincent, but we do not have the primary source. We only know of the existence of these objections through Prosper of Aquitaine. You see, there he is again. And that's why it's important that we know these historical figures. So you have these objections. They're about 12 or 13, possibly 16. I think 12 or 13. So Prosper attributes and says what these objections are. Now, there's concern. If Prosper was a poor interpreter of Cassian, is he also poorly interpreting Vincent? And that's the concern that Augustine Cassidy has. I've brought up his name a few times. But I actually argue that we should think that Prosper is still moderately reliable in how and what he conveys are Vincent's words. What are those objections? So those objections surely are anti-Augustinian. And let me just read a few of those objections, if I can hot link over to that section. Okay, so here are a couple of those objections. And specifically, I was looking for some of the objections that were related to original sin for my research. So, for example, objection 4 talks about the human will. And the objection is this: the greater part of mankind were created by God not to do his will, but that of the devil. The greater part of mankind were created by God not to do his will, but that of the devil. You see how this is related to the Calvinism and Arminianism discussions. Arminians are concerned against Calvinism that God predestines the majority of humans to eternal damnation, whether that be through what some call the doctrine of double predestination, or even if he just passes over, whether that's a meaningful difference or not. So this objection is right in that same family. Let's look at objection 5 here. God is the author of our sins. By making man's will evil, he fashions a nature which, of its own inclination, cannot but sin. This is again a concern that the monks had against Augustine, that Augustine was promoting a view of human will which was unable to will the good. So, okay, let's, in the interest of time, continue to move on. But then throwing a monkey in the wrench of how we should interpret and understand Vincent is that in 1940, we discovered a document about written by Vincent, which is a collection of excerpts of Augustine. And the author thinks highly and reveres Augustine, which doesn't quite fit with the picture we have of Vincent from the Commonitorium or the objections. So some scholars now debate how should we interpret Vincent. And so there's debate over that. And that's something that Vincent foretells in his Commonitorium. He says, in the future I wish to write on the Trinity and the Incarnation. And so the Excerpta appears to be just that. The Excerpta, the Latin short term for the excerpts of Augustine. Okay, so Vincent writes the Commonitorium in 434, 3 years after the Council of Ephesus. So he lived in the first half of the 5th century. The last player of Cassian and Company is Faustus of Ries. And Faustus lives, and his ministry is chiefly in the second half of the 5th century. And he is known for a robust defense. Some have even called him the best defender of Semi-Pelagianism, because he defends what he calls the prima grazia, the first grace, and a view of human nature much different than the way Calvinists and even Arminians would describe human nature. That humans retain a sufficient amount of human freedom to accept the gospel message, but that the only reason why humans have this will in the first place is because of God's grace. So he still couches human nature as backed by divine grace. You see here, it's not an either or, but a both and. God ultimately deserves the credit because without God and his working in the course of human history, from even creating humans, from his work in the life, ministry, crucifixion, and resurrection of Jesus, and then just his common grace to us today, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be in this having this discussion. We wouldn't be talking about these issues about salvation and how humans can be saved. So that's why Faustus is perhaps the greatest defender, because he explicitly defends this view of human nature. With Cassian, it's harder to understand what's going on, and it's not a theological treatise per se. Whereas with Vincent's De Gratia, that is the case. It is a theological treatise. So it's what his view is there is more explicit. And we know that Faustus was not sympathetic to Augustine's views on predestination, because he specifically calls out the predestinarian, what he thinks is a heresy. Now, he is sympathetic in other ways to Augustine's view of original sin, about the means through which a fallen human nature is acquired. For example, the transmission. That is similar to one of the positions that Augustine defends in Augustine's writings. So, Faustus was a very influential church leader. He was a bishop. And his work is so influential that through a series of interesting events brings about ultimately the Second Council of Orange. But some 30 years pass by. Faustus dies, but through a series of weird events, this comes about. So there's one historical figure named Caesarius. And Caesarius was a bishop in southern France, and he had certain other church authorities who were his theological opponents. So he decides to call this impromptu council, which has now been called the Second Council of Orange, in 529. And this impromptu council included laypersons signing on to this statement of faith, as if it's an official church document, and you just have commoners signing on. Now, Thomas Smith, who wrote a biography of Faustus, and one wrote on the De Gratia, has said that it's only on the Augustinian side that you get laypersons signing on to the allegedly official church statements, and that's weird. You don't get that in what official church teaching should be. Okay, so with the time that's left, I want to talk about the Second Council of Orange. I know I've only just briefly talked about the three main guys, Cassian and company, John Cassian, Vincent of Lorentz, and Faustus of Ries. But I do want to talk about the Second Council of Orange. So here's why I want to talk about it. Semi-Pelagianism is defined by, just to take two authoritative texts, the Concise Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church, while not denying the necessity of grace for salvation, maintained that the first steps towards the Christian life were ordinarily taken by the human will, and that grace supervened only later. Grace supervened only later. So the human nature, all on its own, unaided, could accept the gospel message, a person be converted, and grace would come as part of like a sanctifying process, something like that. The Evangelical Dictionary of Theology explains that the Semi-Pelagians affirmed that the unaided will performed the initial act of faith. The unaided will performed the initial act of faith. So this is what's commonly described as Semi-Pelagianism. And so I want to analyze this against the 8 canons of the Second Council of Orange. And in the interest of time, let's just take a couple of them, and let's see if this is what Cashin and company really believed. Well, let's take number 1 here. If anyone says that the whole person, that is, in both body and soul, was not changed for the worse through the offense of Adam's transgression, but that only the body became subject to corruption, with the liberty of the soul remaining unharmed, then he has been deceived by Pelagius' error and opposes the Scripture. Well, okay, looking at Cashin, Vincent, and Faustus, neither of those 3 guys would say that the fall didn't affect human nature in any even drastic way. They did believe in a drastic fall. But the question is, to what extent? To what extent did the fall harm and damage human nature? Let's look at number 5. If anyone says that, like its growth, the beginning of faith and the willingness to trust by which we believe in him, who justifies the ungodly and attain the regeneration of holy baptism, is present in us naturally and not through the gift of grace, ... What happens here with many of the canons is you get the, I'm forgetting the grammatical term for the 3 dots.
Ellipsis.
Thank you, ellipsis. You have the ellipses, is that the plural? Ellipses in these canons, and then in the end it says, let them be an anathema, or something like that. So here, if the beginning of faith and the willingness to trust is present in us naturally and not through the gift of grace. Okay, well, wait a second. Faustus explicitly argues that man retains what I call natural free will. All right? So does this mean it can, it goes in contrast to Faustus's teaching and basically saying he's a heretic? Well, actually, no, because there's a conjunction here. Present in us naturally and not through the gift of grace. Recall for Faustus, what I call natural free will is the prima grazia. It's the first grace. For Faustus, it's both the grace of God and human free will. It's not in either or disjunction. Okay? It's not present in us naturally and not through the gift of grace. It's that, hey, if you think it's there naturally, but it's not the grace of God, that's what is to be rejected. For Faustus, he believed it was the grace of God. So, if we have to be technical, if we're really just trying to get down to the truth here, 5 does not accurately describe Faustus's view. Now, whether that's the intention of the council here is a point of debate. What was Caesarius's view, and was he intending to critique Faustus and his followers? Maybe we need to reopen the debate and say, hang on a second. Maybe the Second Council of Orange is addressing something else. Maybe it's not, though. Maybe Caesarius was really trying to defeat Faustus and his followers. But if that's the case, number 5 is a straw man. Number 5 does not accurately describe Faustus. Let's look at number 6. If anyone says that mercy is divinely bestowed on us when, without God's grace, we believe, desire, try, labor, pray, watch, apply ourselves, ask, seek, and knock, but does not confess that the bestowal and inspiration of the Holy Spirit brings on us the strength to believe, to will, or to do these things as we ought, ... Well, wait a second here. If anyone says that mercy is divinely bestowed on us when without God's grace, okay, well, it doesn't apply. It doesn't apply to Faustus, it doesn't apply to Vincent, and it doesn't apply to John Cashin. They all believed in the necessity of grace for every good action. So, the question is about how this grace functions. And is it a successive view, God's grace then human nature, or is it a different view, one that I think is the case, a concurrent view? It's a both and. It's not neither or. In Augustine, we see this either or disjunction. In multiple writings over his career, he talks about this problem that he thinks about. And he says here, in trying to answer this question, looking at Romans 9 specifically, of course, the controversial passage in Romans 9, in answering this question, I have tried hard to maintain the free choice of the human will, but the grace of God prevailed, Augustine writes. In a letter to Sixtus of Rome in 418, he also says, "What merit then has a person before grace, which could make it possible, apart from a superadded act of..." I skipped a line there. One moment. Could make it possible for him to receive grace, when nothing but grace produces good merit in us. And what else but his gifts does God crown when he crowns our merits? Basically saying, Augustine is saying, it's all God, everything. It's all divine. On grace and free will, which he wrote to the monks at Hadramedum, chapter 33. God then works in us without our cooperation the power to will, but once we begin to will and do so in a way that brings us to act, then it is that he cooperates with us. But if he does not work in us the power to will and does not cooperate in our act of willing, we are powerless to perform good works of a salutary nature. Wow. To me, that's very consistent with what today we recognize as Calvinism. So I'm happy to say here that I think Calvinism is consistent with the later Augustine's view, not the early Augustine. So you see here this either-or concept of grace and free will. For Augustine, it's either God's grace or free will, and if it is free will, humans can do nothing good if there is no grace behind it. So I think that's problematic. Personally, I would disagree with that view and be more sympathetic to the Gallic monks, as I've called them. Okay, so we've looked at the Second Council of Orange and a couple of these canons. And, James is watching. James, great to have you watching today, man. I guess it's been a while, although James is a local here in West Chicago, and I've seen him from time to time. So it's nice to have him watching. Okay, so here's what's interesting about the Second Council of Orange. It was a church council, so it was formally submitted as being consistent with the Catholic Church, lowercase c, Catholic, universal church. So there's a response from the Pope about the Second Council of Orange. And the Pope at the time was Boniface II. And here's what Boniface says in his interpretation of these canons. He writes, "You indicate that some bishops of Gaul, even though they agree that other good things come from God's grace, want the faith by which we believe in Christ to be from nature rather than from grace. They impiously assert that it remained in the power of human free choice, which comes from Adam and is not now bestowed on individuals by the abundance of divine mercy. For the sake of dispelling this confusion, you ask us to confirm what the authority of the Apostolic See, your declaration in which, on the contrary, and according to Catholic truth, you define that true faith in Christ and the beginning of every good intention is inspired in the mind of each person through the intervention of God's grace." Okay, a lot to unpack there. Boniface II says these opponents, Caesarius, that you talk about and you have critiqued here, they say that faith comes from the human and rather than from grace. Well, again, that does not describe the view of the so-called Semi-Pelagians. They did not believe that it was human nature and not grace. It was human nature and grace. It was a both-and process. There's a cooperative action that occurs here. So, the beginning of every good intention is inspired in the mind of each person through the intervention of God's grace. The question is the location of grace. All right? Does grace enter into the person's life after they have been born? Does it somehow snap into existence? Does God perform some act upon their will? Or does God's grace remain from the creative act, is more powerful enough than the effects of the fall to remain in human nature from birth? It's still God's grace. We have to be accurate. If we're going to critique our opponents, we have to be accurate in critiquing their view. That's the only fair way to treat our intellectual opponents. So if you want to say it's not of God's grace, you have to say it's not God's regenerative grace. Okay? You got to get into the precise meaning that people have here. If you paint with the broad strokes, you're going to commit a straw man. You're not going to fairly criticize your opponents, and you're going to make them look like something other than what they really believe. Okay, so we see here from Boniface's own letter, Boniface II's letter to Caesarius, that what the Second Council of Orange critiques is not a view of the so-called Semi-Pelagians. So what I'm basically doing in my dissertation is I'm calling for a re-examination of the Second Council of Orange. I'm calling for a re-examination of the so-called Semi-Pelagians. The term Semi-Pelagian it came 1,000 years after these guys lived. It came first in the writings of Theodore Beza. He was the disciple of John Calvin. 1,000 years after these guys lived, the Gallic monks lived closer to the time of Christ than when this label first appeared. We shouldn't call them Semi-Pelagian. We shouldn't call them Semi-Augustinian. They were their own thing. They were defending what I say is the Eastern Greek tradition, and we should look at them in light of that, so that way we can more carefully look at their arguments and hold them fairly instead of placing them in our preconceived categories. Okay, so that's really sort of what I wanted to say on today's show. I know there's been a lot, but I hope for some people that have been interested and wanted to learn more, I can thank Jonathan. He's one of my followers. I'm sure this episode has gone just as well as he might have imagined. And if you want to learn more, I'd be happy to share that with you. And I'm hoping I'll have a time to even almost craft like a course or a series. So folks that are interested in going deeper and want to learn more about these guys may do so. So on next week's episode, we'll be joined by Rob Bowman, talking about a little bit about gospel differences, but not too much, and other apologetic issues. Looking forward to having him on the program before the Defenders Conference. So Bowman will be the last guest, and then we'll come to you live as best we can from the Defenders Conference, assuming there's a good internet connection. If not, we'll put up the recording of the episode pretty quickly of that panel discussion. That'll be a lot of fun, having the three evangelical views and Bart Ehrman. Bart shared about it on his profile, so I'm excited about that. So I think he's looking forward to the event as well, and so are the three evangelicals. They've all told me, Keener, Lycona, and Bowman have all said that they were looking forward to the event. It will be a lot of fun, and I certainly hope that you'll join us. So if you have more questions, you can email me, kurt@veracityhill.com, whether that's about the Defenders Conference or about today's episode. I'm very much looking forward to being done with the dissertation. Here's the draft. Again, I just have footnotes to finish up. It'll be great to submit and to be done, and then to defend it. Then you're really, really done. But I'm excited about the arguments that I'm making here, and I hope some people will eventually end up reading this themselves. That's a high honor to have someone reading your work and giving it consideration, even if they ultimately disagree with you. All right, well, that does it for the program today. I'm grateful for the continued support of our patrons and the partnerships that we have with our sponsors. They are Defenders Media, Consult Kevin, The Sky Floor, Rethinking Hell, the Illinois Family Institute, Fox Restoration, and did I catch them all, Chris? I did. Okay, good. And I'm also grateful for the fine work that Chris does week in and week out. That promo video was great. Well done. And for those if you want to rewatch that promo video, you can go on to our YouTube channel and hear all the little grunts and noises that the gospel authors make. Those grunts and noises come from Chris. So that's a lot of fun. Okay, and last but not least, I want to thank you for listening in and for striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
You've been listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is a listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.